Well, good afternoon and welcome. We are so delighted that you have joined us this afternoon for the next in our series of webinars. This one is titled Principal Practices for Safe Schools, Stable Groups in Middle and High School. I'm Dr. Shira Shafir, an infectious disease epidemiologist on the faculty at the UCLA Fielding School of Public Health. I'm also the daughter of a school administrator and a parent. So knowing that teachers and students can return to school safely, and knowing that school administrators have the tools and knowledge that they need to feel confident in returning to in-person instruction is of deep importance to me personally. I'd like to begin, as we always do, by thanking our collaborating partners for this webinar: the UCLA School of Education and Information Studies, the California Safe Schools for All team, the California Department of Education, the Association of California School Administrators, and our California Connected Consortium, consisting of the California Department of Public Health and our academic partner, the University of California, San Francisco. We have a really exciting agenda today, and I'd like to begin by introducing the incredible people who are here in order to help share some information and knowledge with you. We have as a subject matter expert, Dr. Naomi Bardach, who is the lead of the Safe Schools for All team at California Health and Human Services. Dr. Bardach is an associate professor of pediatrics and policy in the Department of Pediatrics and the Philip R. Lee Institute for Health Policy Studies at the University of California, San Francisco. Since December, she's been serving almost full-time as the California Health and Human Services Agency as the state lead for the multi-agency Safe Schools for All team. We're especially honored today to have some of your colleagues joining us, several of whom are on vacation and are so eager to contribute that they're joining us on their own time. Not the way I might choose to spend my vacation, but we're incredibly appreciative that they were willing to do so. Dr. Merrill Grant is the superintendent of Fall River Joint Unified School District in Shasta County. Dr. Grant has over 30 years of service working with California Public Schools and is currently in his 21st year as a superintendent in 5 school districts. Presently, he is at Fall River Joint Unified School District in Northeastern California, and he received a doctorate of educational leadership from the University of Southern California. But we'll still like him from the UCLA side. Greg Leland is the principal of Lathrop High School in San Joaquin County, serving over 1,300 students with a staff of well over 100. As principal, Greg is empowered to be the educational leader to provide students with a high-quality education by using and harnessing all of the resources within Manteca Unified School District to address individual student needs. Mr. Leland lives by the vision statement, cultivated with staff and students, a united team preparing all students for life beyond high school, becoming a place of synergy and energy in all aspects of school culture and of community excellence. Greg holds a bachelor's degree from CSU Stanislaus, as well as a master's degree from University of La Verne. He's been the Manteca Unified School District since 1985. He's been a teacher, a football and track coach, department chairperson, activity director, athletic director, vice principal, and assistant principal. And he's a former AXA Region 7 president and served as the California State AXA Delegate Assembly member from 2015 to 2019. Mathew McClenahan is the principal of High Tech Charter High School in Van Nuys in LA County. He's a founding teacher at High Tech Charter High School. Matt was a math and social studies teacher before moving, as he calls it, to the dark side. A graduate of NYU and UCLA's PLI program, Matt's an avid amateur wrestling fan and wants to remind everyone to wear a helmet when riding a bicycle. And finally, we have Mylene Keipp, the principal of Eagle Rock Junior Senior High School. She began her career as a teacher in LAUSD in 1993 and has served as a teacher, mentor, coordinator, administrator, and that magical phrase, other duties as assigned. Mylene's the proud mother of 4 LAUSD alumni, and she met her husband at UCLA's TEP program, and both continue to work with high school students. Her interests include cooking, eating, sports, and reading. She's a graduate of UC Berkeley, UCLA, and Cal State Los Angeles. So with that, with an introduction to some of our amazing panelists and people who are going to present and share with you today, I'm delighted to be able to turn the Zoom screen over to Dr. Naomi Bardach.
Thank you so much, Dr. Shafir. I'm going to share my screen. And you guys can let me know if there are any issues with seeing it. I'm going to put on the slideshow. And I'm here mostly just to put a little framing around the stable groups topic in middle schools and high schools, partly to do a bit of an evidence review so that people sort of understand the rationale behind doing the stable groups, because it always helps when you're thinking about how to operationalize something to sort of understand the spirit behind why the recommendation is there. And then I'll give a little bit of sort of the overarching recommendations from the State Board of Education in California, and also the CDC, and also the U.S. Department of Education recommendations about how to do things. And then we'll turn it over to folks, to the rest of the speakers on the call to really ask some questions, but also really share some lived experience. So I start many of my talks with this set of 2 slides, which is the pathway forward is this. What is this? It's a clear pathway, but there are 2 guardrails. On one side, which we want to avoid, is opening up schools in a way that has no safety mitigations in place. People are not masked, people are closely spaced. There's no sort of stable cohort, there's terrible ventilation. We've seen how that works out from early in the pandemic, unfortunately. That's what leads to outbreaks. On the other side, we have kids not being in school for more than a year, which we also know has happened. So being in distance learning that whole time. The middle road is to use the safety mitigation layers, what we have learned since March about how to have a safe school environment. And that's how we can do it. We won't crash off the road like this. We're going to stay on the middle road. One of those pieces is the stable group piece. So that's what we're focusing on today, particularly for middle and high schools, because it's a little bit more complex, of course, for middle schools and high schools. I'll present some data on transmission in the high schools and middle schools that illustrate the importance of stable groups. And then we'll follow up with school leadership sharing their experiences and key lessons and considerations regarding the operationalization of stable groups in middle schools and high schools. So just to let you guys know sort of some references, where can you find more of this information? As many of you guys I'm sure are deeply familiar with, and maybe you've even snuggled up with this guidance. There's the COVID-19 and Reopening Public Health Framework for schools, K through 12 schools, that's available on our schools hub, which is schools.covid19.ca.gov. There's also the CDE, the California Department of Education resource called Stronger Together, which is reopening educational guidance, and that also has some discussions and descriptions of stable groups. So those are 2 useful starting resources. And then there's the schools hub, which I mentioned is the schools.covid19.ca.gov. It's right there at the very top in kind of little tiny print, but you can easily Google that to find more information. And more specifically, actually, I wanted to show you guys, for school administrators, if you can see my mouse hovering over this piece, you can request technical assistance from the state Safe Schools for All team. You can also talk to your local public health, because local public health sometimes has different guidance, sometimes more strict guidance than what the state team has. But if you have questions regarding our guidance or how to operationalize things, you can go here as a school administrator and put in a request there, and we'll get back to you. And specifically, people ask questions about stable groups. So I also wanted to briefly go over stable group versus cohort, because the vocabulary is a little bit confusing depending on what conversation you're listening to, whether it's California versus a national conversation, and sort of how people use the word cohort in common usage. So what are stable groups? Those are basically the idea that you have a group of students who are staying together, who don't cross over and mix with other students during the day, and they generally have the same staff people who are with them, and that decreases the risk of transmission and increased sort of infections in a school, and also makes it logistically easier if there is a case, then it's easier to deal with. And I'll talk about that in another slide or two. But what's the difference between a stable group and a cohort? Because oftentimes you'll hear people talk about stable cohorts. Generally speaking, they're the same thing, except California has a very specific thing called cohort guidance, which is talking about very small, stable cohorts of 16 kids. It used to be 16 people. Sorry, it still is 16 people. It used to be across all tiers, and we just recently changed to say the cohort guidance really just is in the purple tier. It's relevant for the purple tier. And so we use cohort in a very specific way, referencing that guidance. So for the rest of the talk, I'll just be talking about stable groups, but at a national level or just in common English language, people might say cohorts when they're saying stable groups, and we just avoid it in order to avoid the confusion with that very specific narrow definition of a cohort using the cohort guidance. So this is my summary slide. We know more now than we did in March. These are the layers of mitigation. This is how we keep a school safe, a safe environment for, decreasing the risk of in-school transmission. We know that there are going to be cases that happen in the school, like there's going to be community members who have COVID that walk onto the school campus. It's going to happen because we know that's part of the pandemic. But the key piece is stopping in-school transmission, so there's no additional infections that happen in the school environment. So that's masking, physical distancing, stay home when sick, and screening for people who have symptoms or have been exposed to COVID-19, ventilation, symptomatic and asymptomatic testing, and then this key piece of stable groups. So, why are we talking about high schools and middle schools separately from elementary schools? And that there's two reasons. One, because the curriculum is different, but also because the data have shown that certainly from early on in the pandemic, that high school transmission is different from what happens in elementary schools. And this is based on two studies that came out of France in one particular region of France, looking both at the high schools and the elementary schools in that region. During the time, there was community prevalence of about 9% for COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2, the virus that causes COVID-19, that they measured, they were able to figure out based on blood tests. So it wasn't just like a one-time test of do you have it now or do you not have it now? It's had you been exposed to COVID-19 in any time over the past, I think it was about 2 months into the pandemic they did this. There were no precautions in place in the schools at the time, no masking, no physical distancing, none of that. And what they found is that in that environment, in the high school, 43% of teachers and 38% of students were infected. In the elementary schools, 7% of teachers and 9% of students were infected, which is basically very similar to that community prevalence rate. So from those two studies, we have some implications, which is that transmission can occur in high schools, that crossover, that increased risk of actually getting the infection does seem to happen in high schools. The elementary schools, they seem to sort of more reflect a community prevalence rather than in-school transmission. So why might that be true? Why do children get COVID-19 infrequently with less severe disease? And why might there be a difference between the high schoolers, middle schoolers, and elementary schools? And this is just a brief touch into the basic science piece of it. We know that ACE2 receptors are the entryway for COVID-19. You don't have to remember the name ACE2 receptor, just think it's the doorway into the body. It's how the virus gets into the body. And your ability to make those doorways, the ACE2 receptors, varies with age. Elementary students make less of them than middle and high school students, who make less ACE2 receptors than adults. And the implication is that if there are fewer doorways into the body, tend to have less disease, and also for those who get it, for the kids or the middle school and high schoolers who get it, they actually have more mild disease. So they're less likely to actually cough as hard and less likely to transmit it. And then the other piece about why elementary and secondary schools might be different. So that what I just presented to you was a slide about the physiology, the actual fact of the body that might be different between those age groups. But then we also know, as you guys know very, very well, the difference in the structure. So there's natural cohorting or natural potting up, natural stable groups that happen in the elementary schools. This is a very nice picture of what happens in elementary schools. Kids just naturally stay in the same group, as opposed to the secondary schools where there's lots and lots and lots of mixing, lots of contact across the schools. So it's probably a combination of those two factors, the physiology as well as the structure of the schools. And this is a nice modeling study that people from UC Berkeley actually did over the summertime last summer and just got accepted for into a peer-reviewed publication, looking at what would happen if there weren't any interventions. So they looked at the proportion of each one of these groups, teachers, students, household members, what proportion of them would experience symptomatic illness over the fall semester. And they first looked, what would it look like with no additional precautions? And then what would then testing, masking, reducing contact via the stable groups, and then what are the combinations? And I show this slide for this talk, particularly because of the stable group piece of it. So you can see if there's no precautions, high school, middle school, elementary school, there's still a pretty large proportion of each group experiencing symptomatic illness over that fall semester, particularly here because of that mixing that happens in the students. If you get a stable cohort alone, stable cohorts alone, not combined with testing, not combining with max, stable cohorts alone can actually reduce your risk very well. If you combine them with the masking and the testing, et cetera, you really, really are able to decrease your risks. So we have a very strong recommendation for masking, and then the cohorts can help quite a lot as well. And you can see that that's for teachers, that's for students, that's for household members all the way across. So a brief question of we already talked about the evidence, and now I'm moving into the sort of just generally, why does this make sense to do, and just helping you guys get the framing. The goal is that stable student groups, they don't mix with other groups during in-person instruction because it will decrease the opportunity for transmission. It also facilitates more efficient contact tracing if there is a positive case. If you know there's only this group of students that you possibly could have had any kind of contact with, it's much easier to have a focus group to talk to rather than trying to worry about talking to every kid in the school. It also allows for targeted testing, quarantine, and isolation of that single group instead of a large group or the full school. So, early on in the pandemic, there was one case in San Francisco in one school that a kid had a parent who had a case, and they shut down the whole school because people really felt like they had no idea of how infectious or whether it was going to be passed around the school. And this kind of stable grouping really helps people to do a much more targeted testing and quarantine and isolation. It is helpful to note, and I'll go into the details a little bit more, middle school and high school groups are often larger than elementary schools, because I know that can be a level of stress for administrators to sort of say, wait, how small do these groups actually have to be? So there's a recognition that they're a key piece, but you're not going to have necessarily a 20-person group in middle schools and high schools. Some schools can, but many schools can't. So the stable groups can provide a key safety layer for all age groups. The stable groups are harder to achieve in middle school and high school compared to elementary schools, and they're not required under the guidance. But we do know that a small stable group is going to be more protective than a large stable group, but even a large stable group is going to be better than no stable group. So the question is, how do we do this? I will very briefly go over what the CDC, I am not an educational expert, so I'm going to leave all this to the educational experts, but I will at least put the frame of what the CDC says and what the State Board and USDA, US Department of Ed say. So CDC says that you try doing a single group together in one classroom, and you can have the educators rotate between groups would be one option. Another way is having smaller groups moving together in staggered passing schedules to the other rooms they need to use without allowing students or staff to mix with others from distinctive groups. The US Department of Education talks about teachers and support staff from different content areas can work in teams that share students, maybe even in a dedicated space separate from others. And they give an example. Math, science, English, and history teachers might work as a team with a set group of students that they share. So they might see 4 different groups of 15 students or 60 students total, but they wouldn't see any other students in the school. So you functionally have a stable group of 60. Another way that people talk about is combining grouping with block schedules that reduce the number of courses students attend in any one day. Also, the number of students who interact would be minimized further. So for instance, if you have an interdisciplinary teacher who's teaching 2 subjects at once, you could do 2 groups of 15 students across the interdisciplinary teachers, making a stable group of 30 students. they comment that that might be easier to do in younger students who are not as, that you can have one teacher who can have an interdisciplinary classroom doing, say, math and science together, et cetera. It's also possible to keep students in one stable group that stays together with 1 or 2 instructors who teach them directly for part of the day, and then support their instruction from others who teach them virtually during other parts of the day. So they're sort of teachers for some part of the day and kind of supervising adults for other parts of the day. And then lastly, the idea that you could have a core teacher who's in person with them, but the electives could be offered virtually or organized so that no group of student takes more than 1 elective in a term, and the elective teachers don't work with more than 1 or 2 groups. One other thing that's important to highlight is that cohorts or pods or stable groups, this is language from the Department of Education again, should not group students by perceived ability or in ways that perpetuate tracking. And if it reduces the number of available courses or classes or seats in a particular course or program, it's important to ensure that historically underserved students are not disproportionately impacted by reduced access to gatekeeper or advanced courses or programs. I think we're not, I kind of forget if I'm doing question and answers now. I think we're doing it later. So I'll stop my screen and hand off.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bardach, for sharing some of the science and sharing some of the guidance. We're now very honored to have Dr. Merrill Grant sharing some of his experiences as superintendent of a school district in Shasta County. Dr. Grant, please.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here and share some of our story. For those of you that don't know where Shasta County is, we're a couple hours north of Sacramento, and then my particular school district, Fall River Joint Unified, is an hour east from there. So rural in nature, 1,200 students though, very large geographic area. And we have an interesting case study because we are one of the rare unified school districts in the state that have been open since really day 1 of instruction, which for us was the day after Labor Day of 2020. And we've stayed open since then every day throughout March now, and we're into April, and spring break starts tomorrow, and hopefully we'll have a good finish to the year. But a lot of lessons learned. It has not been easy. It has been, every day is a new challenge, I will tell you that. And in my 21 years as a superintendent, I don't think I'll ever have a year like I've had this past year, among all of you, of course, who are in the field of education. We are unique in the fact that back in July of 2020, Shasta County, if you remember the terminology, we were a monitored county. We were not being monitored. We were in the grouping of not enough cases to meet monitoring status. So in July, at our board meeting, we had the option to open in September with all of the precautions in place, obviously. And at that time, Shasta County had very few cases. And, since then have obviously gone to purple and everything else, but we've been able to stay open throughout the interim. So in July of 20, our Board of Education made a courageous stand based on community input to open up. We followed state guidelines on all the precautions that we needed to have in place, all the PPE, barriers, a testing program that we partnered with our local health clinics on, and we spaced our desks at that time as far as practicable, you remember that word, as we could. It was not 6 feet, and we weren't under that type of dynamic. So we were able to open TK through 12 and start our year. And with that, we did have a distance learning option for those families that did not want to come back. I was surprised in that we had about 15% of our student population opt for that service. So just with some of that, our numbers went down a little bit, obviously, because some kids were not coming to school in person. and we service those kids through distance learning. And then we actually switched to virtual learning in concert with in-person at our high schools. And I'll elaborate on that a bit. So over the summer, we had multiple weeks, which was a blessing in disguise to really ramp up our procedures, order the PPE, make sure that our schools were clean, that they were ultra sanitized, that our buses were ready for kids. We have a very large transportation system up here, and that we could create those stable groups that Dr. Bardach mentioned. Easier at the elementary, we call them cohorts at the elementary, pretty much by grade level, TK through 6. And then our high schools are a bit rare in the fact that they're 7 through 12 junior, senior high schools of about 300 students each. But even though they're a little smaller than a large comprehensive, you can just extrapolate out the economy of scale of how you need to operate classrooms in a comprehensive site. So we manipulated the master schedule as much as possible to create stable groups, 7 through 12. A little easier to do in grades 7 and 8 because they have more core together throughout the day. 9 through 12, very, very difficult. Our directive at the time was we're not going to upend our master schedule in order to create stable groups and therefore get away from the course offerings and the breadth we have at our schools. So we really spent a lot of time on what safety looks like in a school day to day. I was really nervous about kids wearing masks and whether they would follow through. And to their credit, I was really pleased with the fact that staff and students wear masks all throughout the day, grades 3 through 12. But the high school being more independent, I was really nervous about that. And they understood if they want their school to stay open, that they needed to meet these guidelines. And the adolescents stepped up in a way that I really haven't seen in my entire career in working with us as the adults to meet their obligations of staying safe and wearing masks and not, out of eyesight, pulling them down and playing that cat and mouse game. So I was really pleased about how that came through. We wanted to keep our grades together as much as possible without a lot of cross-pollination, but in smaller high schools especially, we do a lot of grade-to-grade interaction throughout the grades 9 through 12, especially in electives, which was a problem. Electives are an issue, and I think we have a question centered around that because there's so much movement in the classroom in certain electives, and there's not the firm seating charts that we really rely on in our core classes. Because what we really saw throughout the year is that our students were not transmitting the virus student to student in school. What would happen is a student would come to school and not feel well then, or somebody in their family tests positive, we hear, and therefore they become positive, they come to school, and the quarantining is what really, really set us back this year. It wasn't so much number of positive cases in the school. There was some transmission, especially around late February at one of our schools. Shasta County Public Health thinks a variant came through the eastern part of Shasta County. They have not confirmed that, but it was highly contagious. And there was a bit of spread in one high school, and we shut it down for 2 weeks and went to virtual learning to pass that time. But for the most part, very few positive cases, but the corresponding quarantine would mean that we were sending 10, 20, 50 kids home based on a couple cases in a school. We did put in a virtual learning component to where teachers have students in class in real time, and they're broadcasting in real time back to the home. And that was really positive for us because the students then didn't lose a lot of class time and have to come back and remake that up. We think it was the right choice for us. Looking back on it, I would say it was a 75% type of school year as far as effectiveness, but our kids were in school for most of the year. And we learned a lot about what it means to contact trace and put in safety precautions. Really looking forward to August of 21 and what the rules of engagement will be then. Thank you for your time. I'm looking forward to the question and answer session. And that is basically our story from the northeastern part of California. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Grant. And now I'm thrilled to turn it over to Mr. Greg Leland to share some of his experiences.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Shafir, and thank you, UCLA, for giving this wonderful opportunity to share today. Listening to Dr. Grant, it reminds me of a lot of the things that we've gone through over the past school year. We have 24,000 students in our district, and a lot of those parents wanted their kids back in school. Some of those parents didn't want their back in school. Our school board, our superintendent, had to very bravely stand up and say, what's our mission as educators? Our number one priority is educating our students. And we've dedicated the last year of our lives to balancing that, the safety of our students and staff, but also meeting the educational needs of our students, because that was very critical that we do that. Next slide, please. We came in with a staggered return to school plan in phases. Throughout every single phase, we have held our students accountable. We held our teachers accountable. We've held our students accountable. While districts around us were giving away free grades or telling kids they didn't have to come back to school, our teachers were really adamant that we didn't want to do that. You know, if we're going to do this, if we're going to meet with kids, we're going to give them an education. We're going to hold them accountable. They need to meet us in the program that we're offering. We had a couple components that were really critical for us. Number one, we're a one-to-one device. So every student in our district already had a device, which was crucial in rolling out this plan. For us at the high school level, we were already on a block schedule. So some of the mitigation was previously spoken about helped us a little bit. When we left for spring break, honestly, we had no idea that we wouldn't be back full force with everybody on campus for over a year. We thought a couple weeks, maybe a month. We still made graduation plans. We ended up doing a drive-through graduation, but we thought we would be back. We took 1 week after spring break and spent a ton of time on professional development and talking about phase one, which would be off-campus learning, remote learning. So every one of our teachers, obviously some of the teachers were much better. Typically the younger teachers are much better with technology than some of us older people. I didn't know how to run a Teams meeting when this whole thing starts. I can tell you I can run one now though, but at that time I had no idea. So we began with off-campus learning, and we did that through the end of the year. When we came back at the start of this year, our plan was to move to phase two as soon as it was safe to do so. We actually ended up moving to a new phase, which was phase 1.5, which we introduced in October, and that was bringing our cohort groups. For us, that was our special ed population, our students with internet access issues, our at-promise kids, our homeless, our foster kids. We brought those kids back first. And then in November, we started with our phase two, brought the juniors and seniors back on campus first. 2 weeks later, we brought back our 9th and 10th graders. Our phase two for us was a blended learning model. We had cohort groups of students. Group A was Monday, Thursday. Group B was Tuesday, Friday. Wednesday remained a remote learning day for everyone. It gave our teachers kind of a chance too to catch their breath a little bit and work with everyone online. On our A days, Monday and Thursday, our B group kids were online. On our B group days, Tuesday, Friday, our A group kids were online. When we first rolled that plan out to teachers, you can imagine their excitement. You mean I get to teach 16 kids in my classroom and 16 kids on camera at the same time? Yes, that was it. We spent a lot of time with our stakeholders. Again, we did a ton of professional development, and our teachers, we can't do this. This is impossible. But you know what? They did it. They rose to the occasion. And we are currently tentatively planning to come back to phase 3, which is full campus learning on April 26th. I say tentative because it still depends on what's happening in our county. But with our phase 3, we'll have everyone on campus Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Wednesday will remain a remote learning day for the rest of the school year. Next slide, please. One of the things that's really helped us is we've had boots on the ground since day one. We came back after spring break, everyone was here. Clerical staff, custodial staff, teachers, administration, everyone. So we've been able to work together, and like I said, most of it has been on teams, which we've found for us has been a very, very effective way to meet. But we created a schedule. I'll talk first about what we did in K through 6. We had a rotating schedule where it was an AM and PM group. So the AM group would go for 2 to 3 hours a day, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Wednesday was remote. The PM group came in the afternoon after we had a chance to clean classrooms and do things like that, so that all our K-6 kids were on campus every day for at least 2, sometimes 3 hours. 7 through 12 was a little different. Like I told you, we did the groups, we did the A groups and the B groups. Next, please. I can also add that what was really critical for me was that personally, I had a very, very positive relationship with the union. In fact, the union president was on my campus. So you can imagine how fun that was for me to look down and see that he was calling me. But we had a great relationship. If I had a question, I called him. If he had a question, he called me. And there were times where he said, I'm not sure we want to do this. And so we kind of talked it out. And I think that's a real key part coming back is being able to include your stakeholders and being able to talk to people. Because again, number one is we want our students to be safe, but our staff has to also feel safe. We constantly upgraded, adjusted, improved our mitigation plan, especially as state and county protocols changed throughout the time. Things, and I'll talk about some of these things, but mandatory masks, social distancing, one-way signs, wash stations at various places on campus, as well as in the classroom, doing the daily health server, putting what we called air scrubbers into the classroom, and I'll talk a little bit more about those. That's my amazing admin team down below. We have a lot of fun. You know, we've reinvented the way that we do a lot of things on our campus. Engagement culture is huge for us. So we had to find ways when kids weren't here every day, how could we continue to engage and connect our students to campus? Next slide, please. And the classrooms looked different. I've got a picture of some of the students that are actually in class, and you can see that they're socially distanced in the classroom. They're spread out. I've also took a picture of a couple of our teachers that were teaching online hybrid programs. In the phase 2, we decreased the classroom size from 34 to 16 or 17. It allowed us to spread out a little bit in our workspaces. We told the teachers, hey, you've got the front of your room. Nobody comes into your space, and you create that space however wide you want it to be, at least 6 feet. But some teachers said it, they like to move back and forth, so they set it all the way across the front. Teachers were able to physically distance themselves. And again, we had hand sanitizers, sink, soap in every classroom. And teachers were able to move their classes outdoors if they wanted to. And as the weather's been nicer at times, some people will do that. Next slide, please. I talked to you a little bit about our classroom. We call these air scrubbers. We brought these in at the end of November. They had 3 speeds: small, medium, large, or small, medium, fast. The air scrubbers came in without the little thing in the top of the screen. You see that muffler at the top? They came in without the mufflers. So if you can imagine how loud those were before we got the mufflers on, but now they're great. Teachers turn them on full bore. when kids aren't there, and then when kids are in the classroom, they turn it down to low. Next slide, please. I know I'm running out of time here. Our campuses look a lot different. I won't tell you a lot about what we did, but again, we had to try to find different ways. Next slide, please. We had to try to find different ways to connect our students to campus. And I didn't get a chance to talk about the daily self-screening survey, but every one of our students does a daily self-screening survey every day. And if they get a red check, they are not allowed to come to school. If they get a green check, they come to school, and then we actually contact trace all of those kids with the red checks. I'm sorry I went so long, but anyways, thank you. If you have any questions, you're welcome to email me anytime.
Thank you so much, Mr. Leland. I'd now like to invite Mr. Leland to come back on along with Mylene, Keipp, and Dr. Grant and Mr. McClenahan, because we understand you have some questions that you'd like to answer, and we'd like to provide the answers to those.
I think,
I'll ask the first question.
Yeah, you got it.
For Dr. Bardach, passing periods and hallways, that natural flow, any recommendations on how to mitigate that? And within the 6 feet for 15 minutes in a 24-hour period, does that cover that issue in its entirety?
Yeah, great question. So I think we saw in the CDC guidance, or maybe it was the Department of Education, talking about staggering schedules. So as people think about those passing periods, if you can have the passing periods happen slightly different, 5 minutes apart, and it has the potential to make people a little bit crazy. But if you find that you feel like your hallways are super crowded, that is a key way that transmission can happen. And so that would be one way to do it, where you could stagger your schedule so that the passing period happens at different times for different stable groups. The other thing that people use, which I think you guys might have already also thought of, or other people might have heard of, is people also sometimes have directional flow on their hallways, so that you actually have tape on the floor, what the arrows showing people which direction you should go, and so it helps to keep things kind of separated so that people are not just passing each other and sort of willy-nilly. The other thing is making sure that people really remember mask during those hallway transitions. Don't take your water bottle and sip on it while you're walking through the hallway, right? So being very thoughtful, helping the kids just think that part through, because it might be something that they would normally do. So just helping them to remember. And then the last part is this contact tracing question is the goal for the contact tracing is to make it sort of as intuitive and as doable as possible. So having a kid remember who did I pass in the hallway is just not feasible. So it wouldn't be something that we expect kids or even adults really to do. So I wouldn't include that unless they're sitting there and chatting for a long time with somebody in the hallway, which hopefully they're not doing. But that would be something that the kids would be reflective about. And hopefully what we do is we do the prevention by helping educate them about their natural tendencies and helping them to remember to not do those certain things. But that would be, if it was a long period of time, you'd want to figure that out for the contact tracing.
Yeah, will the vaccine eligibility of ages 16 and up change the structure of small stable groups in high school settings? And what about the mask wearing?
So vaccines are the light at the end of the tunnel, right? We are coming out, which is really, really fantastic. What we are talking about in terms of the fall is being able to start to think about how does vaccines kind of change things for the fall, and even for the summertime, late summer, summer programs and all that. So for the 16 plus, for people who have been vaccinated, the goal, and even with or with, so the goal of the vaccination program, we know that by the time we get to late summer, early fall, we anticipate that all adults in the school setting, anybody 16 plus, and then adults at home will have had access to vaccines. And that will really allow for less of these restrictions. Masking will still be a key piece, because not everybody in the school setting will have been vaccinated. But in terms of being able to say stable groups, they're restrictive. It's hard to get a full school operating with a stable group. So the goal is to allow for full in-person instruction, understanding that those vaccines are going to help us get through that tunnel. Oh, and
Dr.
mask
Bardach.
wearing. Oh yeah, so mask wearing, sorry. The answer to that was yes, sorry. Go ahead.
Dr. Bardach, the guidance on stable groups seems to have a wide range. I've read 60 to 80, but less than 100. Could you explain this?
Yeah. Stable groups is something that I think the spirit of the stable group is really important for people to understand what is the rationale behind the stable group. And so that's what I wanted to sort of convey in those early slides. But we also know that every school is slightly different. We've already heard 2 examples of schools where you just have to think about it in different ways and be creative about it. And so that's why there's a pretty wide range. And so my hope is that people say, okay, smaller is better, but there's also going to have to be some flexibility to recognize the reality on the ground for different educational curricula. And it has to be part of one of multiple different layers: masking, physical distancing, ventilation, all those things put together, plus whatever stable group you can form.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bardach. How do you suggest structuring lunch breaks? How can this be structured so that stable groups don't mix?
I will give an answer, but I think actually the people who have already been doing it on the ground are probably going to have way wiser answers than I will. But the recommendation is that people should stay in their stable group during lunch. Sometimes people do like really very visual things in the yard or in the outside area or whatever, so that people really stay in their stable groups. They kind of know how far apart they need to stay. There's a little, blue dot where every student can sit. That kind of thing can actually sometimes be very helpful. And then the other thing that sometimes we'll also talk about is because the 3 feet of physical distancing is about kids in classrooms. And then, but if it's 6, but we say during eating, you have to have 6 feet of physical distancing. So some people split a group in half. So one half the group might go outside and the other half stay inside and eating with that 6 feet of physical distancing, and then switching during the lunch hour. So that's the other thing that I've sort of heard.
Do you foresee that the 6 feet for 15 minutes in a 24-hour period contact tracing will be modified with the 3-foot separation directive?
It's a great question. It's and one that we thought about. We actually even talked to the CDC about this. It's a pretty solid recommendation. It's across sectors. The CDC is not planning on changing that. So there's going to be no change to what is defined as a close contact. It will stay as a 6 feet distance within 6 feet. That's defined as a close contact and an exposure. So, so that means that if you're doing 3 feet of physical distancing or whatever, less than the 6, then the students around that positive contact, that positive case, will be considered a close contact. But it's not the whole classroom. Sometimes people feel like it all of a sudden changes the whole classroom. You don't treat a whole classroom. If you're doing very specific contact tracing and talking to kids and you have a seating chart, then you don't have to take a whole classroom out. It's just the people in physical proximity.
Dr. Bardach, when we conduct extensive contact tracing and all students are identified through a classroom seating chart, which identifies those within 3 feet and 6 feet perimeters, can all of those students outside of that perimeter continue to attend class?
Yeah, so it's exactly that. That's right. All those students outside the perimeter can continue to attend class. There are some schools and some counties who have decided to say a full class is going to have to go into quarantine, in part because it's especially for the younger kids. Sometimes, they wander around, they chat with each other. It's very hard to sort of limit that behavior. Generally speaking, in middle schools and high schools, people have found that as long as you have a seating chart, you don't have to close the whole classroom, but different people are different, and depending on what your case rates in the community are, people might have different comfort levels with that.
Thank you.
Is it safe to rotate teachers and paraeducators through the stable groups?
Yeah, there's, it's interesting because there's slightly different guidance between teachers and paraeducators. The paraeducator, generally speaking, the recommendation is try to keep them away from other, if they're doing like a one-on-one support to a student, try and keep that just to the one-on-one to that student. Teachers rotating through the stable groups, as I sort of mentioned in that in the original slides, that would be something that would happen. That they would have, that there might be some teachers passing around stable groups, which functionally, if you have the example they give from the Department of Education is you have a 15 group, stable group of students, but the educator moving around kind of makes it functionally a 60-person group. But that would be something that would be, not unusual, I think, in the middle school and high school setting. And the key part there is keeping that for the adult, 6 feet of physical distancing, masking, all of that helps as we do these kinds of rotations. And the student group staying relatively stable can also help in that situation. So even if there's one point of contact going around to different groups, if this student group is stable, then it just decreases the risk of transmission in general.
So how do we adapt stable groups for students who need services for their individualized education plans? They might need more movement, or being in one space might be constricting to them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's probably a little bit more about what to do to support those individual students rather than the stable group piece of it, though they're related. People talk about doing mask breaks. Some students have, whether neurotypical or not neurotypical students, like they still have issues with having the mask on all day long. So doing mask breaks, having a place that's safe in the school environment to go sit outside or go be outside. There's kids who are sort of wanderers or might need to, leave the classroom. That's a little bit harder. So I think that having, talking to the student ahead of time, helping them think through what that might look like, what would be a safe plan for them, is sort of a key piece of it, as it is sort of with any IEP or anything, helping kids to anticipate that rather than having to react to it once it happens.
With the announcement of progress on the vaccine for 12 to 15-year-olds, do we anticipate being in stable groups in the fall?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So I think the 12 to 15-year-old vaccination, it's such great news that it's effective. It will probably still take some time to actually get that enough vaccine out and vaccinating enough people to sort of say, enough 12 to 15-year-olds to say that it will affect things much in the fall. But as I was saying before, I think because we know we're going to have wraparound vaccinations in all those other groups, we're able to feel pretty confident that by the fall it will look different, and there won't be an expectation of stable groups in the setting of people being vaccinated and having masks still in schools.
Thank you so much for all of your questions. We're now going to switch, and we're going to have Dr. Bardach as our subject matter expert on infectious diseases and epidemiology and pediatrics ask questions about what it actually looked like for all of you doing this.
Yeah, so I'll start with Greg first, if you don't mind talking a little bit more about this. When you were planning for stable groups, what did you think were the most important factors you considered? And then did you modify your approach much to stable groups since you opened?
We talked about so many things, and we met with our stakeholders too to ask them what they thought was critical. But schedules, students switching classes, how much time would we need in between classes to clean the classroom? Desk placement, seating chart, where was the teacher going to be in proportion to students? Those were a lot of things we took into consideration. And after we started, of course, there were more concerns, but we address those on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything that you would sort of recommend to people thinking about as they're making their decisions about stable cohorts to anticipate?
Give yourself some time, do a phased-in approach, and include your teachers in the conversation.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Great. And Dr. Grant, can you also talk about when you were initially thinking about, using stable groups, what do you think your greatest concern and what did you anticipate to be your biggest challenge? And then how did you sort of approach that?
I thought masks were going to be a real problem for kids, and they'd really try not to wear them, but that did not happen, thankfully. Kids are social denizens at these ages, and they're really hard outside of the scope of the eye in a classroom to keep track of. And you will see pods of kids forming, right? Whether it's lunch, even though they should be 6 feet apart, or they all go out and maybe get in a car together to go home. And you're saying, oh my, everything we've just done from 8 to 3 is gone. That's my biggest concern, is what they're doing out of school and bringing back into school. And that's where we have very little control, and we can't beat ourselves up as administrators when that's happening. We can control what we can control and do our best, but don't beat yourself up on a positive case that comes into your school and causes disruption.
Yeah, no, I think that's wise. It's people hold a lot. Administrators are holding a lot. So, what did you find any useful like messaging at all for the students, either around after school activities or masking or anything that you felt was particularly effective?
Yes, thank you. That's something we did take ownership of, is education. We thought we did a really good job from 8 to 3, but telling them about what you do on a weekend, and if you bring that into school, how it could disrupt everything we've worked towards and close your school down. And it resonated, but we're talking human nature here too, and that has to be considered. Yeah,
and forgiven and supported, and we need to be compassionate for our students. And then a question actually sort of for all of you guys, what advice do you have for middle school or high school principals as they reopen their schools and or implement their stable groups? And maybe we'll start with Mylene about that.
I definitely want to reinforce the compassion piece. We're all human. We're all living through a pandemic together. And this is the experience of our students. We want them to remember us as kind, loving people who are doing our best to make the campus safe. And our 12-year-olds who are our middle school students, it's their first time on campus. It's our seniors who have that heartbreak of graduating. It's our teachers who want to do their best, our families who want to do their best, and going back to the principals, we carry a lot on our shoulders and we're not alone, right? So I want to give a shout out to Greg for having a photo of your admin team, because I know I can't do this without the incredible administrators, counselors, coordinators at our school.
Thank you. And Matt, do you want to give your advice?
Yeah, so what my advice is this, is we're right at the beginning of this. We're in LA County, so we're just starting to walk through all of this. And frankly, it's really scary, right? This has been a really difficult year, and what Greg and Dr. Grant have talked about is really amazing. But it should give everybody hope that there are solutions to a lot of the problems out there. And our watch phrase is, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Right? We cannot do everything. We can't do everything we did a year ago. We can't offer all of the classes in exactly the same way. And we're going to err on the side of keeping people safe.
And Dr. Shafir, I know we only have a few minutes left. Was there any questions, burning questions that you saw in the Q&A or the chat?
Yeah, so there's one question I was hoping you could sort of provide some insight on. Someone has asked if you could comment on how excluding students based on seating charts can contribute to stigma regarding COVID-19 positive status and to bullying, particularly given that the smaller the group of students, the easier it might be to identify and suspect. And if in particular you can provide some insight about some of the work that CDPH has actively worked on with respect to COVID-19 stigma and bullying.
Yeah, it's a really, really, really important question. It's there's one other piece to sort of help pull out, which is that in the setting of doing more youth sports right now, actually sometimes there's a positive case in youth sports, and it can sometimes affect then the school cohort. So as superintendents and principals are thinking about how does that interact, I think it's really important to try and maintain the privacy of any student who's positive in youth sports as well. And as you all know, it's there's regulations and laws about keeping people's privacy. So you cannot disclose who is a positive case. I think the point about, sometimes people can use logic to kind of figure it out, I think is actually really important. And so it goes back to, the role of the school administrators to set the tone and set the culture in the school. And we're trying to actually talk more about that and help people think that part through about, people get COVID in many, many, many different ways. It is not a sign of moral failure. It's like everybody's in it together. And the goal is to try and help keep each other safe and, be supportive for anybody who might have a positive case. So setting that tone is really, really helpful and important to sort of prevent these kinds of things from happening. And the last thing to say is, if you have a positive sports case, you don't necessarily need to quarantine like a whole classroom, right? You might need to quarantine a whole team, but it goes back again to, if there is a good seating chart, you don't need to quarantine a whole classroom. So just for people to think through the sort of the practical logistics there.
Well, thank you very much for that answer. And since you did mention school-based sports and some of the risks inherent there, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that the next in the series is coming up on April 15th, 2 weeks from today, really specifically talking about school-based sports. We do also have a risk communication training that helps figure out some of the things like how it is best and provide tools on appropriate communication around COVID-19. We are so honored to have had Mylene, Keipp, Greg Leland, Dr. Merrill Grant, and Mathew McClenahan join us, along with Dr. Naomi Bardach. Thank you all for taking the time from your very busy days in order to be here, contribute, and learn more about stable groups. And we look forward to seeing you all at a future webinar.